Very excited to have you here for Jim's show, To a Groove.
Yeah.
And we're here to talk about that and other things.
Yeah.
I've had a lot to drink, so you're on your own.
Should I interview you?
yeah, that might work. So I thought we'd start with just a little background on Jim Watt. A lot of you know him. Some of you don't know him. Jim and I met about 10 years ago, but he had a life before that. And for 25 years, Jim, at least 25 years, a very successful, prominent architect, had an office in New York and also from Asbury Park. And really, Jim helped to revitalize Asbury Park. If any of you have been down there, the great, great Asbury Park. You know, I mean, they talk about Bruce Springsteen, but...
Deliver me from somewhere.
That guy.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, that guy. So, so I wanted to ask you how you decided to become an architect and an artist, but was there a fight with yourself? Are you going to be an artist or an architect?
At a certain point there was, not in the beginning. So my mother is here, Peggy. So she told me from the time that I can remember that I was going to be an architect. And the reason that she told me that, I believe, is because I was always making stuff with my hands. I was always painting my bedroom different colors. I was designing furniture, building furniture. I had a grandfather who was wonderfully generous with his time with me and teaching me these things. And my father was a contractor. And I liked to draw, and I found perspectival drawing when I was very young. And it was kind of like learning a magic trick. It was amazing to be able to represent three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. And I can remember as a kid, there was a landscape architect who was a friend of my mom's. His name was Ray Hodnett, and he taught me perspectival drawing, and it was just so much fun. So anyway, I was just interested in these things, mostly making things with my hands. I really like to do that. I had my late cousin, Frank Tomeno, who's my mother's first cousin, was an architect. So he was a very big part of my life and my family. And it was something that was never in doubt. That's what I was going to do. And I wasn't maybe exactly sure what that meant to be an architect, but I certainly trusted my mom.
My mom never told me I was going to be an art dealer. I mean, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and my mom, it was always, and my stepfather Ted, always interested in the arts and in music and in jazz and in drawing and painting. And her friend Nancy McGarry, who was here, had a prominent career at the Met and at the Whitney, the Breuer building, and that was part of my childhood. That's what we did. We would go and visit Nancy and get kind of backstage passes, so to speak. And what a treat, what an honor that was. And so when I graduated from high school, I ended up going to architecture school at Temple University. And I had a studio professor, his name was Norm Krecky. And he held class at the Philadelphia Museum of Art 3 days a week. So we had, instead of textbooks, we had to buy a membership to the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And I fell in love with what was inside there. I had been exposed to museums and galleries, but not in that kind of way where I was spending hours and hours in the museum. And there was a specific painting that I saw by Anselm Kiefer in the contemporary wing of the Philadelphia Museum of Art that just captivated me. He was saying something in that painting that resonated with me so profoundly that I decided that I needed to start painting. And I did. so I had this kind of parallel thing going on where I was studying architecture and I was using the empty classrooms in the architecture building in the middle of the night to paint. And I fell in love with painting. I fell in love with architecture kind of at the same time. And luckily, I was taught by professors who believed in kind of the Renaissance idea of the visual artist, the architect who painted, who sculpted, the painter who very, very much, Corbusier, obviously Michelangelo, but we don't really think of that. We kind of put everybody in these silos now, but luckily the people who were teaching me were very encouraging about, me continuing to paint and doing that as part of my architectural study. And then I got into a graduate program at Princeton in architecture and was, at that time, very interested in painting. And I went to my mom and I said, "Ma, I think I'm going to be a painter." And she said, "I think you're going to go to Princeton." So that was a good call. So I went to Princeton and had a wonderful experience there and continued to paint. And at a certain point, the practice of architecture just took over my life. And it wasn't until years later that I kind of came back around to painting. So that's a very long answer to your question, but that's kind of how it happened.
Right.
And, I really credit Norm Krecky, who was my freshman studio professor, with just introducing me to the contents of that museum in a way where I could really immerse myself. And I think I realized that I wanted to be an artist, whether that meant making buildings or making paintings or making sculpture. I knew at that moment, when I was 18 years old, that I was going to be an artist. Yeah. And I've never been too concerned about the labels. I mean, obviously architects make buildings and painters make paintings, but to me the juice is the same. Like I get the same feeling from the creative process.
You're a wonderful draftsman. I've seen you came up to my house in Catskill, you drew the house. It was like hanging on the wall. And when I first met you, your paintings were much more figurative, buildings and recognizable color and form. Yeah. And then want to talk a little bit about your progression?
Yeah. I think, when I started painting again, let's say it was, 12 or 14 years ago, very regularly and seriously, I think that I was painting very much like an architect. And I was thinking about space and form, kind of coming at it through my kind of architectural brain. And so I think what I was doing was I was kind of abstracting architectural kind of cityscapes and landscapes, and I was doing what I was familiar with or comfortable with. And there was a lot of kind of perspectival vanishing points and all of that kind of stuff in that work. And I can remember that Charlie Hewitt, who Jim represents, he's a wonderful artist who I got to know through Jim. And he saw a solo show that I had, which was a lot of paintings that were about architectural form and iconography and that kind of stuff. And he was very complimentary about the work. He said, I'm very glad I liked the work because I knew our paths were going to be we were going to become connected, and it would be a real bummer if I didn't like your work, So he got that out of the way. He goes, I like your work very much. He goes, but I can't wait until you realize that these forms, this kind of the way you're painting now, is just an excuse for you to get into a painting. He said, he said, at some point, you're going to realize that you don't need those things. And at that point, your paintings are going to radically change. And I somehow instinctively knew that he was correct, like that he was completely correct, and that what I was doing was a bit of a crutch. And I trusted Charlie because I loved his work, because, you've been showing his work for 30 years now at this point. And sure enough, I think that gave me the confidence to start to let go of some of those crutches, some of those formal crutches that I had. And what happened over time is that I realized that I'm in love with color, which is kind of a not obvious kind of thing for me, even I certainly now, but at the time, I mean, I had always thought of myself as an architect, right? So form and space, that's what this is about. And I realized that I was so interested in color and how color made me feel, and how working inside of harmonics and dissonance with color was something I was really, really interested in. And then I became very, very interested in kind of the two-dimensional surface quality of a painting, while at the same time having this kind of implied space where your eye gets pulled through the surface of a painting into something deeper, and then all of a sudden brought back to the surface because there's all this stuff happening on the surface of the paint. And those two ideas became something that I just leaned into and realized that that's what my work was going to be about. And I think that once that started to happen, it was very easy for me to let go of the formal stuff. And I really started to paint like a painter. And I think it took me time to find my voice as a painter. And I feel like I have found it. I feel like I'm expressing me, who I am as an artist, in a way that's so much fun and so exciting. And to be able to do that with Jim as my dealer is just like, what a gift. So.
Yeah, well, it's a gift for us too. I was just thinking about, like, when you're painting, and I want to talk about jazz because that's a big, thing that we want to talk about with your work, and I know it's a big thing
huge
with you.
Huge, yeah.
But just when you're painting, are you thinking about? Are you always in the present, or while you're painting? But are you thinking about like what your art's going to look like in 5 years or 10 years? Or do you ever do that? You ever go down the road?
Well, I think it's a very timely question, because this show is called To a Groove. All the paintings that you see here are called To a Groove. And before I started this series, I had just finished a very large commission, which really, by the time I was done with it, I was really struggling with this idea of a commission, right? Because it's like an architect having a client, and I don't want to have clients anymore, So I found myself not being completely present to what I was doing in that moment. I kept having to realize that I'm trying to make a good painting here with a specific set of criteria, and I pulled back from that, and I'm happy with the body of work that I created. But as soon as it was over, it was like I need to just paint for me, right? So I need to just paint to my own groove, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And so I think that it is, that is not a black or white thing. I don't think you are ever living 100% in the present and just kind of, painting, with a capital P. And you're never sort of distracted and thinking about it or self-conscious about it. It kind of, it flows back and forth in those things.
What about the title? Where'd that come from?
So To a Groove, I did, Danny Clinch is here. Danny Clinch is an amazing photographer, filmmaker, who has become a dear friend of ours. Antoine Dry and Mike Nordzi are over here, the trumpet player and brilliant musicians, just absolutely brilliant. So the four of us made a film together. And in that film, Antoine is speaking to Nordzi, but it appears as if he's speaking to me, which I love. I'm very flattered by that, And he says, if you want to go to a groove, I'll follow you, right? Because they are playing purely improvised music while I'm painting. And the film is very abstract. It's not a documentary, and Danny did just an absolutely brilliant job with it. And I'm so proud of being a part of that. But that, Antoine's line, "If you want to go to a groove, I'll follow you," is my favorite part.
Yeah, it's a good one.
So I was trying to think about, I was obviously listening to a lot of music while I was doing this, and I didn't want to name the series after a specific album or a specific, artist. And then I thought of that line, and I'm like, that's what it's going to be. Because that implies what I was feeling. I was feeling very liberated and very present and very I was in a groove. And I felt like that groove was it felt very authentic to me. And so it was a nice way of tying this series to the film and to my dear friends who I made the film with. So to a groove.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the film, by the way, what the project was 1,000 watts of India ink drawings that he did while the jazz musicians were playing. They were playing off each other. They were watching the art, and Jim was listening to the jazz, and it was done to raise money for jazz musicians during COVID that were suffering. So it was a great project, and it's a great film that, I don't know where exactly.
Anybody who's interested in the film, I'll give you the link to it. It's only 14 minutes long, but what we talked about when the idea was kind of hatched was that it would be as if Danny and his camera people and myself and the jazz musicians were all a part of the same ensemble, and we were vibing with each other. That Danny was not documenting something. He was a part of it. I said, I would love it if you could make sure that you and your camera people, your shooters know that I want to feel the presence. I don't want you to be hiding somewhere. I want to feel that, and I want that to affect the work. And I want it as if he was playing bass and I was playing drums, right? And when we started the first shoot, Danny came into my studio and he did a sketch, and we set up this, all of a sudden there's this movie shoot happening in my studio. It was so much fun to be a part of. But I'm looking at Antoine and Norzi, and they were in the corner, whispering to each other. So they said, can you come here for a second? I'm like, yeah. I'm like, what's up? And I could tell they looked a little concerned, and they're like, what are we doing? So I said, I really don't know. But I said, here's the deal. Pretend I'm in the band with you, and I just happen to be playing an instrument that makes visual imagery as opposed to sound. So I want you to look at what I'm doing because it was projected on a screen, so they could watch it in real time and then respond to it musically. I said, just treat me like I'm in the band, And then we did the project. And Antoine says to me, he goes, man, I know why you did this project. He goes, because you've always wanted to be on the bandstand with us. And finally, we did.
Yeah,
So it grew out of the pandemic, which was kind of just a charged time anyway. But to do that with, Danny and his team, and Antoine and Mike specifically, but also all of the people that Antoine musically brought to the table, was like a dream come true for me, because I am a huge fan I'm a huge jazz fan, and I have been really my whole life, and that's because my mom is a jazz fan, so I was weaned on it. It was, WBGO was playing in my house from the second I woke up until the second I went to bed. It was it was part of my kind of DNA. And something that as a kid, I think jazz is like wine, it's it requires context. It requires, you got to understand something about it. You got to practice, relating to it. Oh, Miles Davis.
There it is. Wow.
Miles is happy about our conversation.
So how did that affect that project affect your paintings after that? Or I wanted to know about how jazz and music impacts
Well, I think that's a great question. I think that that project coincided with me really feeling like I was finding my voice as a painter. The ink washes were a different thing. Even aesthetically, they're a different thing. And I won't get into that because it's kind of a distraction from the question. But I realized that with this toolbox that I had as a painter, that I could express some of the ideas that I loved in the world of jazz in my work. And that really has to do with, improvisation, uncertainty, embracing uncertainty, having the chops to know that when you're soloing as a jazz musician, and I say this not as a jazz musician, but as somebody who certainly knows and appreciates jazz, that time between your previous note and your next note is a magical time of embracing uncertainty and being confident in your virtuosity, that you can surrender to that uncertainty. You don't have to think anymore. You can just be, and then the next note happens, and then you do it again. And in jazz, that happens very quickly, right? Because the notes happen very quickly. And to me, to listen to these guys play, and to listen to all of my heroes of jazz play, to me, it's a celebration of a surrender to uncertainty, where the music, you start jazz is about it's about playing the head, which is playing a melody, right? And then the musicians take turns improvising. Then it comes back to the head, and then they can do it again or not, right? The structure of the tune, but that's the basic structure of jazz. You play the tune, you play My Funny Valentine, whatever the tune is. You play the melody, and then the musicians take turns embracing that uncertainty. That's my turn. Antoine refers to it as spontaneous composition, because it implies the artistry that's involved, the virtuosity that's involved. And that idea is something that I really leaned into as a painter, right? Trusting that what I was looking at, based on what I had previously done, the mark that I had previously done, was going to lead to something that I could surrender to, that in between, that liminal space between the last brushstroke and the next one, was going to be something that was just going to happen. And the more I let it happen, the more exciting it was to me in terms of the process. But I think that what happened too is that feeling the confidence that I had found my voice, that it led to very exciting things that made me very happy as the viewer of my own painting while it was happening. So to me, that is the overlap to me of, that is where one of many areas where jazz has informed my work.
So would you start with a melody, as a painting, like a...
I would start with the opposite, right? I would, like, where a jazz musician would find themselves lost in a solo, where the structure, the form, the structure of the song had dissolved and become something very, very free.
It started with
a melody. I started with something completely free. I have we'll call it a series of notes, which would be a palette, right? Colors. I know what colors I'm going to use. That's the only thing that I know. And then I just start painting. And then at a certain point, the architecture, not to, use that term, but the architecture of the painting starts to reveal itself to me. And that to me is kind of like the melody. It's kind of like finding the melody through the improv as opposed to the other way around. And then the challenge is to not get too hung up on the architecture of the thing, still letting it be fresh and still sitting in that position of kind of ambiguity, uncertainty, and not knowing what's going to happen. And that's a very tricky thing, and you kind of fall off of that on one side or the other. But that's to me why I like working in series, right? These are everything I've done over the last probably 7 years is a series of paintings. And the reason I like doing that is because it never puts too much pressure on one, because I just start the next one as like a continuation of what I was working on this one. So yeah, I mean, it's really it's never one thing or another.
I mean, if you would describe this series,
Yeah.
what holds it together as a series? Is it the colors, or is it the...
I think the colors hold it together. I think that there's kind of a framework to all these paintings. There's sort of an implied horizon line, although these are not landscapes, and there's kind of a grid, a very loose grid that I sometimes I find a way to introduce into the painting, and then it dissolves and comes back, and there's a point where the grid is there and not there at the same time, and then I feel like, okay, that's good. That's kind of where I want it to be. And then there's this idea of kind of sort of luminosity, as if the painting is lit from behind, and a lot of that has to do with the spatial, the implied space of the painting. So to me, it's about, again, this kind of formal framework, like a melody, and this thing that's much freer than that. And color, color to me is a whole world in and of itself, and I think that the emotionality of color, the intellect of color, is something that I can't really describe it, but I know that it's a mountain without a peak. I'm going to spend the rest of my life working on that.
It's like pornography. You know it when you see it.
Yes. Exactly.
Yeah. I was going to ask you what artists that you think about, if any. And I know, and Jim's also produced some plays. I produced a play, Red, about Rothko.
Yeah.
I thought of Rothko. I thought of the commission you just said was your Four Seasons.
4 Seasons. That was my 4 Seasons.
Yeah. But
as he's talking to Philip Johnson, what's the line? Because Jim played Rothko brilliantly in Red. Mr. Johnson, nobody who eats food for those prices in that space are ever going to look at my paintings. And he quits the commission. The biggest commission that's ever been given to a painter since probably the Renaissance.
Although his paintings were like he wasn't. You never felt like he was doing them for a restaurant, even though he was.
He was
when he realized
he was. But I would imagine, that's it's an undeniable truth of a commission. That there is a voice in the back of your head that's saying, I have to please somebody with this. A very specific somebody. At that time, it was Philip Johnson who had teamed up with Mies van der Rohe to do the Seagram's building. And this was going, these huge paintings were going to basically be the walls of the Four Seasons restaurant. And I think the kind of angst that I had at the end of doing the commission that I talked about that led to me wanting to find my own groove again, I can't imagine that Rothko wasn't going through that same thing.
Yeah.
But I love Rothko. And I think there's a book that I want to write. And maybe
I have a Rothko at home that Jim painted. He painted it for the show, but to me it's as good as any.
We're going to try to sell it and make a lot of money.
I actually just sold it to Nodler's for $10 million.
I love Rothko, and I believe that I'm going to get up on my soapbox a little bit about Rothko and Miles Davis. So Rothko painted the Four Seasons commission in 1958 and 1959. And Miles Davis made an album called Lift to the Scaffold, which is a French new wave film that he scored. In real time, he watched the film, and then he hired a French band. He brought them into a studio, set up a screen and a projector, and they scored the film in real time when they watched it. No edits, no second takes, no nothing. That led to the next album he did was Kind of Blue, right? Which is arguably the greatest jazz album that's ever been made. I mean, I'm not going to say that. It's one of the most popular that's ever been made. This was happening at the same time that Rothko did the Four Seasons paintings. And I don't know about any of you guys, but I've spent quite a bit of time in the presence of Rothko paintings, and I've spent quite a bit of time listening to Lift to the Scaffold and Kind of Blue, and they make me feel exactly the same way. Precisely the same way. And I think that there was either, the sort of the ether, the zeitgeist, whatever you want to call it, they were swimming in the same water, and the same cultural water, and I think there's a strong connection between them. So, to get back to your questions, what artists do I like? I love Stanley Whitney, who's a living artist, and I just adore his work. Jerry Mishak is here. I love Jerry's work. Obviously, the artists that Jim shows. I'm not just saying that, they've had a huge influence on me. I spent a lot of time with not only their work, but them personally. So they are probably the most impactful in terms of day-to-day. But going back to Anselm Kiefer, when I was 18 and discovered a Kiefer at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, Georges Baselitz, Per Kirkeby, I mean, these are painters that
A lot of Germans.
Yeah, well, I think there's something about that post-war those German artists that, I think that liminal space that I'm talking about, that kind of in-between, that non-duality where it's not this or that, I think that they realized that was the antidote to what the world had just experienced. That non-duality was the way forward from that. And I respond to that non-duality in their work. Like somebody like Baselitz is both an abstract and a representational painter, and sort of both and neither at the same time. And, same thing with Kiefer. Kiefer will have, his painting will be covered with hay and dirt. And then all of a sudden you realize there's this wonderful kind of landscape that he's painted in the midst of all of that. And you're somehow caught between this being this purely abstract thing and this kind of almost, bucolic landscape. Nobody would call Kiefer bucolic. So that's probably the wrong word. But those two things were happening at the same time. And I think that those post-war German neo-expressionists were interested in that the non-duality that I'm interested in their own way. And I think that's probably what spoke so loudly to me about seeing Kiefer's. I felt that. And I was like, ooh, so that touches me in a way that I haven't felt before.
Yeah. Well, Kiefer's born 1945 in Germany, the year the war ends.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that work is so intense and personal. And I was thinking, because Jim and I will talk politics sometimes, not too often. We try not to.
Yeah.
But I find you to be you're a very optimistic person,
Yeah.
even today. And,
my wife's shaking her head.
and well, compared to me, maybe. But
I think you're an optimist.
how does that come into play at all?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I think that I'm interested in painting things that make me happy. So to me, painting is a way to painting is an antidote to the things that don't make me happy. And I don't frame it like that, but when I think about it, when I'm painting, and I put this color next to that color, I realize it makes me intensely happy. Mm. And I'm not ashamed of that. Like a lot of artists I think are like, they gotta be a little edgier and like, a little more fucked up than that, And I think my paintings are fucked up in their own way. Like they're layered, emotionally they're layered. So I think that, my friend Damien Peduto, who is a Tiffany stained glass expert, he said, and he wrote one of the essays in my book. He said that my paintings are like the paintings of a child, and that you look at them and they sort of make you happy. And then when you spend time with them, you get sucked into something completely different than that just initial happiness. And I think that's a pretty good description of what they are for me, is that they do colors, certain spatial representations make me very, very happy. But I keep working on them until there's something else there too, you know? Or maybe the other way around. Maybe they start off with that something else, and then I back into the things that make me happy.
And a lot of happy accidents.
But I think that that to me is back to this kind of non-duality thing. It's not one thing or another. You know, it's not like these are just happy, optimistic paintings, and they're not just these kind of dark and pessimistic paintings. That they're sort of both of those things at the same time. But I would agree with you. I take that assessment of me proudly, that I'm an optimist, because I think that's what we need right now.
No doubt. No
I do.
doubt. I don't want to go on too long because I don't know where we're at, but you had said something the other day about having certain rules or certain, when you paint. And
Yeah.
I was curious about what you meant, or what are the rules? Are these rules that you learned from in school? Or,
No, I think that...
Did you go to art school, by the way? I mean, did you?
No, I just went to architecture school.
Okay, yeah.
For a long time. And I studied a lot of art history while I was in architecture school, like a lot. When I went to Princeton, it was nice because I already had a professional degree as an undergraduate, so I had a 5-year degree. So all of my technical stuff, all my engineering and my statics and, physics and all of that structures, I had done all of that. So the program that I was in allowed me to peruse the university completely. So I took a lot of, philosophy and religion and art history, and I just kind of perused the university, which was really it was really great, So I didn't go to art school per se, but I really feel like I did. I feel like I did. I was immersed in that world, and I never really thought myself as not an artist, even when I was studying and doing architecture. I always felt like an artist, and I always embraced art history in the same way that I embraced architectural history. But the rules to me are only interesting if you discover them for yourself.
Yeah, your own.
Your own rules. Like I feel like, I can describe it best by saying when I haven't followed those rules, right? There have been paintings that I've made, not necessarily recently, because I'm pretty clear about what my rules are. But before I was very clear on my rules, I was trying to find myself as a painter. And there were times where I painted things which I was like, wow, that's a really interesting thing. But it has nothing to do with me. It's not me at all. It's like, it's the difference between art and design. It was kind of like I was designing a painting. And I've had these arguments with people where they'd be in my studio and they're like, oh, that's my favorite. And I'm like, well, that painting's going to go away because I'm going to paint over it. And they're like, what are you talking about? I'm like, that has nothing, that's like such bullshit. It's complete bullshit, that painting. And I know it's bullshit. And I'm not implicating you for liking it, because I like it too. But it's I designed that painting. I didn't make that painting as me, the artist. And I think that that's my biggest rule. That unless it feels like me, then I'm doing something completely wrong. And my north arrow on my compass as an artist is that I feel like I'm getting closer to the painting being finished, the more it feels like me, almost like a self-portrait. Like when I walk in here, I feel pretty good about all these paintings. And when I look at them, they feel just the way I feel. Now, what that means, I don't know. Like, you know what I mean? Like that's like a very esoteric, weird thing to say, but it's true. It's true. Like when I look at these paintings, it's like looking at myself. That's my biggest rule. And if it doesn't feel that way, then it's complete bullshit. And I have no interest in doing that. And
That's interesting. Is architecture the opposite? Because architecture, you have to design a building.
yes, architecture is interesting for very different reasons. There are very, very brief moments of intense creativity, but they are brief. And there are a million forces at work. Like if this is the project that you're working on, there's city officials, there's a client, there's bankers, there's the community, there's the public, there's codes, there's timelines. This cup is, if this was a piece of architecture, that would have been informed by about 1,000 different forces, each having 1,000 different criteria which go into it. So
That's interesting. So in painting, you're all those.
I'm all those things, and
Yeah.
that's such a luxury to have.
Yeah.
It's such a beautiful thing as a painter where you can do that. And I must say that I didn't dislike that as an architect, but I didn't have enough time in that sweet spot of creativity to make me really self-expressed and fulfilled as an artist.
Yeah.
You were solving other types of problems, which was interesting, very interesting. How do you convince, if you guys were a community board coming out to scream at me about this building that I built, and I have to convince you that no, it's actually something you should be okay with. That's a whole nother problem to solve. But it's not creative in the way that we're talking about
Yeah.
painting. Yeah.
So why don't should we throw some questions?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that a question?
Oh,
Oh.
well,
Not you.
not me.
No, you.
So you have a visceral connection to your paintings, and I'm sitting back here, and I'm thinking of, you haven't mentioned the edges of your painting, and this seems to me the father of the others. They seem to emanate from this, and I see perhaps headlights in the distance and a rainy road, perhaps cars driving down, and I see this area of scratchiness as you're moving your brush across. This is orchestrated so beautifully, and the colors work so well together. You have foreground and background. I'm sure you're drawing on your architecture background, but you haven't talked about how you set it up at the edges, how that leads you in. And I'm thinking of Paul Klee, who said, take a line for a walk. You're taking colors for a walk.
Well, thank you.
I'll take it.
I'm glad we recorded that. That's going to be in my next book. Laura Einstein, by the way.
No, well, but talk about the edges of it and how that leads you into your color study. Because it's not just the main focal point, it's the whole perimeter and the painting.
Well, thank you for that that meditation on my work. I think that's beautiful. And I hope I deserve that,
It's true.
To me, so the first thing I do in a painting is a canvas is I paint it cobalt blue. That's the first thing I do. And I think that to me, and I almost invariably leave a corner, usually the bottom right corner, unpainted and a spot of that original cobalt blue. And that's kind of an edge that is kind of a memory of where the whole thing started. And I think the reason I paint, when I was a kid, I used to paint my bedrooms blue. At the time there was this color, it was called colonial blue, which is a form of cobalt blue. It's like cobalt blue mixed with like Payne's gray, I think. And it made me feel a certain way. Like I liked the way it made me feel. So to me, to start the painting with a cobalt blue as opposed to white was really, I don't know, just again, selfishly, it made me feel good. I think the edges are interesting because I'm often interested in letting the edges be a little less refined.
Remarkable.
Yeah, like a little more about, like, it's just paint on a canvas, you know.
Right.
This is just you're moving around pigment and medium on a piece of cloth, basically. And I like the reminder of that as I'm doing it also, but also as the finished product, I'm interested in that. But I think one of the reasons that I introduced this horizon line into almost every painting that I've done for the past 5 years is that it implies that the edges aren't the edge.
It goes on.
There's an implication that this is a fraction of something much bigger. And that's, to me, what's interesting about an edge. Because the edge could be kind of a bookend, or it could be just the last thing of something that's going to the last thing of this, but really it continues on.
Formidable for continuing the
Yes,
experience.
Yeah, and I think just formally that kind of horizontal line implies that the thing continues. So thank you for that one.
Yeah, very nice.
Hello, hi Jeff.
Hi.
I was curious about your journey from architecture to the self-actualization, as you describe that, the existence for you between design and art in that liminal space that you personally perhaps were living in or negotiating. I was just curious about how you made that full transition from architecture and saying, okay, I'm going to do this, and then living in a city where art tends to be darker. I make textiles, I make happy clothes too. How is it when you're spreading happiness in your art? Like, how is sort of the response in the context of this kind of darker, dimmer time?
That's a great question. I think if we lived in a very happy, light, euphoric time, maybe I would make like darker paintings. You know what I mean? I don't know. But it feels like a little bit of an antidote for me personally. And hopefully for somebody who is looking at the painting, experiencing the painting. But for me, in terms of the question about design and the process of designing and the process of being an artist or making art, they are so distinct in my mind because I've spent a lot of time doing both. And what I realized, and I think that one of the reasons that I stopped practicing architecture, I still do projects occasionally, and I love doing them occasionally. When I was an architecture student, everything was done by hand. Like, we did drawings, and we did sketches, and everything, and we built models, right? And I remember in 1987, that same Norm Krecky put us on a bus and brought us to the Whitney, to Nancy's museum, and there was a retrospective on Frank Gehry. And Frank Gehry's models, to me, I was like, this is his art form. This guy loves sculpting these models. These are sculptural objects that he puts as much of himself into as his buildings. And to me, they were so much more interesting than his buildings, the sculptures, the models. And I really got very, very good at drawing. And Jim says, like, I went to Jim's house, and the first thing I did was did a drawing of his house. And to me, I was shoehorning the artist Jim into the architect Jim in my drawings and in the models that I was making. And I would say the first half of my architectural career as somebody who had my own practice with my own name on the product, all I did was drawings and sketches and models. And then the world of architecture changed. And it became all about the computer. And I realized that all of the people that I was hiring, some of them were my students, because I was a professor of architecture. So all of my students, they didn't know how to draw. So then they became, I very selfishly handpicked my best students to come work for me in my office. and tens and tens of very talented young people came to work with me, and slowly the idea of making stuff with your hands went away, and it became about the computer. And I quite literally lost interest. And I know that sounds maybe a little shallow, because the architect should be about the building, about the final product. To me, it was about the process. It was about spending the day and ending up at home realizing that I had so much lead all over my arm because I had just been drawing all day. Or I had so many calluses on my hands from an X-Acto knife of making these models that I was shoehorning the artist Jim into the architect Jim, And then I was like, okay, well, how do I design my life where I can really just be an artist? And I think that for me, it was about the craft of architecture was so rewarding to me. And when I felt like that craft, for the most part, was taken out of the practice at large, is when I kind of struggled with continuing inside of that, if that makes sense.
Oh, it does.
Yeah.
That was a personal question.
So is this the first series with music manifestation? No. So how do you compare? Is there a time differential when you're doing a series with music versus without?
It's always with music. It's always been music. Always. It's never not been with music. Even my architecture. I can remember listening to Chick Corea's acoustic band with my headphones on when I was 19 years old in North Philadelphia in architecture school, doing the drawings that I was talking about with the lead all over my arm, completely inspired by what I was listening to. Listening to Ahmad Jamal, like the soundtrack. And it's interesting because, wonderfully, MJ and Aaron, I wrote down all the albums that are kind of like in heavy rotation in my studio. And if you click, there's in front of the desk, there's a thing from Spotify. If you click on it, those are all the same albums I've been listening to since architecture school. So it's always been music. It's not about music, but music is a big part of my process and inspiration.
Cool. Ileana.
Segue from music to color. Your other obsession. Creating color. How do you create color?
The way I create color is tied into this idea of improvisation. Because typically, I have 4 colors that I use, maybe 5. I have alizarin red, I have cobalt blue, most recently ultramarine blue, I have cadmium yellow, I have Payne's gray, and I have titanium white. That's it. And I use those out of the tube, and I apply them to the canvas, and then I start to mix them on the canvas.
All basic.
I just use basic primary colors, and more recently you'll see some different reds that are in here, but for the most part it's those basic colors, and then I have so much fun. Just the canvas becomes my palette at that point, where I'm mixing and finding all kinds of wonderful, happy accidents that happen. And then you're dragging one color against the other, and then something wonderful happens. And pretty soon you get pretty good at having a basic understanding of what could be happening. There's like, it's purposeful, but it embraces the uncertainty. So, yeah, I love figuring out what those colors, when mixed together, are going to say on the canvas, as opposed to going to a table or a palette, mixing a color and applying it to the canvas. And that's one of the rules back to rules, like that's my rules. I have these very, very basic colors that I use, and I mix them on the canvas. Never not on the canvas. That's a rule, And that's fun to have those rules because it allows you to, the rules give you a certain freedom. You know?
Do they change over time?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think so, absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's like, it's like the Renaissance, right? The Renaissance had so many wonderful rules, right? Like, the top floor of a building, the windows were smaller. The higher you went up, the windows got smaller. And the idea was, it was this kind of false perspective. It made the building feel taller. That was a rule. If you look at any Renaissance palazzo structure, anything, that top floor, those windows are significantly smaller than the windows in any floor below it. That's a rule. But that provided wonderful kind of freedom for Alberti and Michelangelo. And then, those rules provided freedom. So I think that the rules are freeing, not constricting.
And of course, they're made to be broken.
Yes.
Yes. Anyone else? This is great. Very nice. Well, I think we scratched the surface, so we'll have to do it again.
Yeah. I just want to say thanks to Antoine and Norji. But what you were listening to them play was an expression of all of these things I've been talking about. So hopefully it created a charged space for us to have this conversation. I feel like it did. So thank you guys.
Absolutely.
Thank you.